Welcome to Meta Breakers, a series that I do every Sunday. We are coming to the end of week 2 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and so I have hand-selected some of my favorite mythic decks. And so these are all pulled from people who have successfully climbed the best of one ladder, and caught my attention because of how the deck was doing, or if a unique approach. So first up here, we've got the Golgari Midrange by Cellier, who went 49 and 31 for a total of 61%. It was a pretty decent win rate, and was taking kind of a unique approach to the Golgari Midrange. So we've got 2 copies of the Phyrexian Obliterator. For 4 black, you get a 5/5 trample. Whenever a source deals damage to the Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. So what we do is we make it fight. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you cast this spell during your main phase, the creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Then those creatures fight each other. Because one of the, usually they just let this go through. They don't want to block it because then they have to end up sacrificing a whole bunch of permanents. So, and I apologize. There are actually 4. They have the alternative skin for the other Phyrexian Obliterator. So, kind of a fun little thing that you can do within the Golgari space. Then we've got kind of the typical like Shieldred, Glissa Sunslayer, Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, the Urborg Scavengers, which works nicely with the Glissa Sunslayers because they get to steal things. So when Scavengers enters the battlefield or attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it has flying as long as the card that was exiled has flying. Same thing for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. So Glissa Sunslayer being able to give things the First Strike, Death Touch gives you kind of this nice little synergy between these 2 cards. Preacher of the Schism, which if you look back at the 50 match summary that I did this week, I ran Golgari Midrange, running 4 copies of Preacher of the Schism. This card is amazing, especially against the Mono-Red, which can kind of struggle with the 4 toughness. And then the fact that it has Death Touch means that it trades very well, but it also can give you card draw. It's just overall really impressed with the Preacher of the Schism. We also have Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which can allow you to exile a card and then it gains all of the activated abilities of the card that is exiled. And there's nothing that is coming up immediately in my mind about why this was in here other than just a little bit of repeatable graveyard hate, unless you're trying to get the Gix. So I was kind of surprised by the Agatha's Soul Cauldron. But we've got Mosswood Dread Knight, which is this recurring threat and can be played out on turn 2. We've got way less spot removal than what we were looking at in the one that I ran for the 50 match summary. So we've got Go for the Throat as well as the Bitter Triumph. No long goodbyes, no cut downs. 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat, which should help against the more controlling matchups. This card is worse the more spot removal that you're coming up against, so it's typically weak against Mono-Red. So very interesting deck, and I thought it'd be worth exploring. Here's a couple of options that the creator was looking at. So we've got the Cut Down, we've got 3 copies of Duress, as well as 2 copies of Pilfer. Number 2 was Sultai Poison by Acclaim. And it had 106 matches and 71 losses to barely squeak in at 60%, which is still a very impressive win rate over that many matches. So Sultai Poison is kind of taking it's a mixture, right? So we saw the kind of the white blue space that was splashing green for Venerated Rotpriest, and this is going off of the kind of the blue black poison space, which was a budget option. Right, and so we're bringing in Rotpriest and being able to play it off of Cavern of Souls as well as the Botanical Sanctum, and otherwise it's the list we've seen before. So we're trying to get some early toxic damage with the Skull Dweller. Then everything else here is just like proliferates or has toxic. So we've got Aspirant's Ascent until end of turn target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying and toxic 1. Whisper of the Dross, target creature gets -1/-1 and you proliferate. So proliferating is when you double a counter that already exists, so you can give them another toxic counter. Same thing with Experimental Augury for digging and giving them another toxic. Prologue to Phyresis, draw a card and give them a poison counter. So even if they can kind of stop your combat getting through, this just gives them the poison counter. So this can be kind of helpful for getting things started. Serum Snare allows you to bounce, and then if it was 3 or less, you proliferate. Blight Belly Rat, when it dies, you proliferate. Drown in Ichor, -4/-4, and then proliferate. The Voidwing Hybrid, whenever you proliferate, return Voidwing Hybrid from your graveyard to your hand, and then it's a 2/1 flying toxic for a blue and a black. So this is a nice recurring threat as long as it doesn't get exiled. Distorted Curiosity, if your opponent has 3 or more toxic counters, they're corrupted, so you can cast this for 1 blue and draw 2 cards. And then we've got Vraska's Fall. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker and gets a poison counter, giving you that little bit of an edict with the same kind of poison synergies. So, and then as far as the sideboard, it looks like they were considering Vincer, which is a 1/3 lifelink toxic. Whenever you proliferate, if you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token, or target artifact creature you control gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. So this could help maybe stabilize against maybe mono-red. And then the Mocking Sprite instances and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, but it doesn't really have the synergies with any of the poison or toxic in the deck. So I do know that the toxic strategies tend to do relatively well against the control decks, and so after playing 50 matches of Golgari Midrange and coming up against a lot of control, I thought this one looked particularly appealing. Third up on the list here is Mono-Red Prowess by Prince of Thralls. And Mono-Red Prowess is not really an off-meta pick, but this deck was doing enough that it's not exactly what you're seeing every list doing that is the Mono-Red Prowess deck. So I thought it would be worth exploring to see if it is performing better or worse than the Mono-Red Prowess deck that I cover pretty much every Monday during my meta review. So this one went 80 and 45 for a 64% win rate. And, we see a lot of the core of the deck, right? So we have the Slick Shock Show Off, which is the flying haste from Outlaws that you can plot. It gets +2/+0 whenever you cast a non-creature spell. We've got Ancestral Anger to draw a card while also cheaply triggering the prowess of the deck, like with Swift Spear. And there is still 1 copy of the Codebreaker, but dropping a lot of those. And then we've brought in 2 copies of the Invasion of Regatha, which can deal 4 damage to any target, and then 4 damage to your opponent's face, and then 1 damage to a target creature. And then it flips into a 4/4 prowess. Most of the time, though, you're not really interested in flipping this. But I thought this was an interesting inclusion because it does trigger prowess and it deals 4 damage directly to your opponent. And then we've got Lightning Strike, 4 damage straight to the opponent. Feldon, Ronom Excavator, Blazing Crescendo, Dreadmaw's Ire. Kamano faces Kakazan, which is classic. 4 copies of the Swift Spear, 4 copies of the Monstrous Rage, a Phoenix Chick, and then the Sawblade Scamp. And this one was one that I thought was interesting because I played a turn 3, a deck that was aiming to get a turn 3 win in Izzet. And it was mostly red, except for it was playing the Scorching Viper that we got like way back in Wilds of Eldraine, if I remember correctly. And that list was running Sawblade Scamp. So you get a 1/1 that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to put an oil counter on Sawblade Scamp, and then you can tap it, remove an oil counter to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So it kind of gives you that ping for 1 effect, and then you can also be playing this on turn 1 and attacking it immediately for damage. So it gives it like a +1 damage to all of your spells in a sense. And then we've got 4 copies of Shock. And just favoring the 4 copies of Shock over the Play with Fire, which gives you the Scry, which I thought was kind of a choice, because Shock is basically an inferior version of Play with Fire in my mind, because it does the same exact thing, costs the same amount, but also doesn't give you the Scry if you shoot their face. So could probably just replace these with Play with Fire, but I liked the direction that this was going in. It's a relatively cheap deck, so I know it's going to be appealing to beginners and people who are new to Magic the Gathering, and they did very well on the best of 1 ladder with this deck. Number 4 was Rakdos Midrange by Falling Block. And, I did one that was a Rakdos burn deck that was basically a mono-red deck that then had the Sellsword. in black. And this one is actually more of a proper Rakdos midrange deck. So your classic like key card from Crimson Vow is or was it Midnight Hunt? I think it was Crimson Vow. Blood Tithe Harvester. You get a 3/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you create a blood token, then you can sacrifice it to give a creature -X, where X is twice the number of blood tokens that you have. And there's not a whole lot of blood token synergies going on in this deck outside of it. But it's still removal as a creature as well. We've got interaction with like Cut Down, Duress, the Forsaken Miner, that was a new one from Outlaws, that whenever you commit a crime, you can pay 1 black, and if you do, return it to the battlefield. Really curious to see how this one plays out. 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat to disrupt our opponent's plan. 2 copies of Go for the Throat, as well as 2 copies of Shoot the Sheriff. 1 copy of Abrade. NT Cynical of the Sun to give us kind of some additional dig. 3 copies of Preacher of Schism, 3 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor to kind of take advantage of the evasiveness of the Deep Cavern Bat. And then we've got Liliana of the Veil to hate a little bit on control. Hidetsugu Consumes All, and this was one that, if you go back and you look at week 1 in the best of 3, I was covering a Rakdos Midrange that did quite well in the standard challenge, and the sideboards were messed up, so I wasn't able to actually show you this, but this has been being explored in the best of 3 tournament scene as an answer for Boros Convoke, because the first chapter destroys each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less, so it's really good for getting rid of all of those 1-drops in Boros Convoke, and then you get a 3/3 trample that whenever it deals damage, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then if it deals damage to a player, if it has dealt exactly 10 or more damage to that player this turn, they lose the game. So, but it's a body on top of removal and is kind of an alternative to the temporary lockdown, Brotherhood's End, Path of Peril, whatever sweeper you're going to be using against Boros Convoke. And then we top off with 3 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse. So this card, I can't remember if I mentioned the win rate for this one. So this one was a little bit lower as far as the match, like number of matches, but they went 38-17 for a 69% win rate. So I imagine that's going to come down a little bit, but I definitely think that it could be fun to explore and see how it does on the best of 1 ladder. And then the last one that I'm wanting to explore for week 3 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction is a straight up Mono-Black Aggro list. And I don't know how to say their name because it's just symbols. So I apologize, but they went 62-30 for a total of 67% to hit into Mythic. And it's similar to, it's got kind of a little bit of the 2. So there's Mono-Black Aggro and there's Mono-Black Skeletons, as I covered in week 1 of my meta review. And this is kind of bringing the 2 together, sort of. So we've got Forsaken Miner, which is a skeleton that recurs, that we talked about in Rakdos Midrange. Tiny Bones joins up, which is really great if you're interested in committing crimes, because then every time that you play a legendary creature, you commit a crime. Tiny Bones the Pickpocket is a 1/1 death touch that allows you to play stuff from your opponent's graveyard. The Lost Jitte allows you to so you equip for 1 legendary artifact, and then whenever you deal damage, you put a charge counter on it, and so it doesn't have to deal damage to the player. It just deals damage, period. And then you can choose to remove one of those counters. You can do this at instant speed. You don't have to do this only when it deals damage, but you can untap target land. You can target creature can't block this turn, or put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature. So I mean, I think this is worth exploring with the Deep Cavern Bat and ramping ahead of your mana, and then also being able to make it so that they can't block if they do have an answer. We've got March of Wretched Sorrow, which is deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life. You've got Go for the Throat, 2 copies, 4 of the Corpses of the Lost, because there's that skeleton kind of sub-theme that's going to be happening with Gisa, or is Gisa Zombies? Sorry, Gisa's Zombies. But Corpses of the Lost will still work with the Forsaken Miner. And then we got Preacher of the Schism and Liliana of the Veil, and 1 copy of Shieldred, 2 copies of the End, where we get to exile target creature or planeswalker and then get rid of it entirely. So this card is particularly nice for icing a Jace, and then Azorius Control can't mill you, or hitting the Wandering Emperor, and then that removes it as a card from their deck list. So the end giving you kind of like removal as well as a pithing needle effect. And then Gisa the Hellraiser, whenever you commit a crime, you get 2/2 tapped zombie rogue creature tokens that also get +1/+1 in menace as long as Gisa the Hellraiser stays alive. So giving you some of that crime payoffs for the Tiny Bones joins up. So, and then we got Mishra's Foundry for a little bit of manlands, and then the one Blast Zone was a little bit of a head scratcher for sure. And then some of the cards that they were considering were some Soul Guide Lanterns for some spot removal in the graveyard, the Filigree Silex, which we saw in the Azorius control matchup in the Pro Tour, 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse to give us some graveyard, as well as an ability to trigger a crime on our opponent's turn. So some of the crime decks are exploring using Unlicensed Hearse because you can get Gisa to trigger on your turn and then use the Hearse on their turn to get it to trigger off at instant speed. And then 1 copy of Nightclubber for additional hate against the Boros Convoke strategy. So vote here on YouTube in the community tab and let me know which one you would like to see me attempt to climb the best of 1 ladder with. And if you like this sort of thing, remember to click like and subscribe. I do these every Sunday to explore some off-meta picks compared to the list that I will be covering tomorrow, which is the more popular, Mono-Red Prowess, that sort of thing, as well as how the week breakdown of how the best of 3 tournament scene has kind of panned out. So that I'll leave you guys to the rest of your Sunday, and take care, everybody. Good luck with your matches and RCQs, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.